I think it's worth just starting by remembering what happened around the referendum. There was a determination by David Cameron to hold a referendum and a promise given in the manifesto. There was a leaflet delivered by the government just before the referendum, costing £9 million, putting out the government's case for staying in. There were all sorts of speeches made in the House of Commons about how the referendum result was going to be binding. And then the referendum itself took place and produced a reasonably decisive majority. And it's against that background that we've got to face the future. But we've also got an establishment and a parliament with a very different view, by and large, very much on the Remain side. And I think that sets the frame for the difficulties that these negotiations have run into. Because if there had been a different result in the general election, in 2016, I think the government would have been in a very much better place to have taken the initiative in the referendum, in the Brexit discussions, in a way which didn't actually happen. I mean, if the government at that stage had gone to the European Union 27 and said, we are happy to trade on WTO terms, we don't think that is the best outcome, we think the best outcome is a free trade deal, very much on the lines with Canada, but probably with some extra bits thrown in, especially around services. I think that is a position which would have put us in quite a strong given us quite a strong negotiating hand in dealing with the EU, because they would have had to come to us, at least to some extent, with their proposals, rather than getting us into the situation we're in now. Because once we'd had the general election, and it became quite clear there was no majority for the fallback position of WTO, then all the cards really fell into the EU 27's hand. And I did have a meeting with Michel Barnier a couple of weeks ago, and what really came out of that very clearly was that his remit was to look after the integrity and the security of the single market and the customs union, not really to look after us. It doesn't mean that he had a sort of punitive view, particularly about what should be done. But I think the notion that the negotiations we've got are going to proceed on the basis that we're going to finish up with a lot of concessions coming out of the EU 27 on freedom of movement and all this kind of thing is really an illusion. I think what's much more likely to happen is that we'll get a repetition of the sort of statements that were made there to go by Barnier about what was going to happen with next round of negotiations, which is to do with the period of up to the end of 2020, after we're supposed to leave the EU at the end of March 2019. And even then, we've then got the next stage, which is dealing with trade, and I think we're unlikely to be asked for more concessions there, which really amount to almost exactly Britain staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, probably maybe in the EEA, maybe not, but effectively with all the constraints that the membership of the EU currently provides for us, but with no say in what happens next. And indeed, potentially then being carried along with what the EU is developing in terms of more integrationist policies, maybe a European army. I mean, there's all sorts of movements in the European Union which are not really what the British people want, but we'll have no say in whether they go ahead or not. So what I think is likely to happen, I think these negotiations will drag on for the next few months. And the really crucial question then, at the end of the day, is when this comes to Parliament, are Parliament going to accept the result of the negotiations, which I think are going to look pretty unsatisfactory to a lot of people there, and pretty unsatisfactory to most of the electorate as well. And I think the really sort of doomsday scenario which we may be confronted by is that there simply isn't a majority in Parliament to accept whatever deal the government manages to negotiate. And what will happen then, I think, is hard to call, but it does look as if with the sort of choice in the end of the day we're going to be confronted with is either just to pack it all in and rejoin the European Union on whatever terms are then available, which may involve joining the euro, may be involved in getting more involved in integration, the army and all the rest of it, or falling back on WTO terms. And what the outcome of all that would be, I think, is hard to call. I think a lot will depend, really, at the end of the day, on how hardline the EU is. I think the mistake they made in negotiating with David Cameron running up to the referendum was that they actually gave very little and overplayed their hand, and I think they may do so again, but we shall see. So I think that the future is very uncertain, very hard to predict which way it's all going to pan out. But in the meantime, I think we are in a very difficult position over these negotiations with a lot to play for.
The project that I'm leading is called 28 Plus Perspectives on Brexit, where 28 is the UK, the other 27, and the plus is Brussels. It was a catchy title and it got funded. But seriously, it started from a hunch, and all good research starts with a hunch, that quite possibly, as Britain's withdrawal sort of began and so on and so forth, there may be a little sort of lack of focus on the perspectives of the other 27 member states and Brussels. And if I could just, I don't know if Chris Wilkins is still here, but he made my point for me, where he said, quote, the unity of purpose amongst the EU 27 came as, quote, a bit of an eye-opener, end of quote, to the government. So we started with this idea of that we wanted to look at the other member states and Brussels, and particularly because we feel that we operate in a national system, where it's quite hard to disseminate information, thoughts, feelings and so on about the EU 27. Isn't it the case that the outgoing German ambassador recently wrote quite an interesting piece about how we're a little bit obsessed in the UK with, in popular culture, he was making that example, with our sort of wartime history, our heroism and so on. So we are in a country where film, humour, sport, just to mention three, I think make it quite difficult for us to talk about the EU 27 without talking about them ganging up and so on. Simon Cooper, writing in the FT at the weekend, recently talked about how being in the UK is like being in a glass house. Everyone can see in, everyone can speak our language. It's a bit hard as a nation for us to see out and to talk to others in their languages. Final sort of thing on why we thought it was important and how it's quite hard to disseminate sensible information about the EU 27. It does come down to something else that Chris Wilkins talked about, which is the educational foundation. This is something I can go on about for ages, but in UK higher education, European studies has taken a nosedive. It's having a bit of a revival, Brexit studies and so on. Erasmus, which the government wants us to carry on buying into, so student mobility. There is a drive at the moment by British universities to double outgoing mobility, but the numbers are still infinitesimally small. They're tiny. In other words, our project, we think, is situated in a sort of a national educational environment where it's a bit difficult to talk about the EU 27 and so on. So that's what we wanted to do. We actually focus on certain EU 27 member states, so I can only take questions on some of them. Seriously, we chose the member states, and again, the previous speaker mentioned this, where it was expected that populist pressures at election time, so in France, the Netherlands, for example, and Germany, for that matter, that the hypothesis was that populist pressures in those countries could actually lead to a kind of domino effect, Brexit, so on and so forth, which hasn't yet happened. So we looked at those, we focused on the elections, and we're also looking at negotiations, and this is where I come to the exam shortly. So we're looking at negotiations in theory and practice. The second half of the project is called A Guide to the Multilateral Negotiations. I've got some of the co-investigators are here in the room, and thanks for the input for this. So let's talk a bit about the negotiations, shall we? I'll come to So the first question on the paper is, what is the current state of the negotiations? Again, I allowed myself to be a little bit astonished when I heard earlier that the first phase wasn't really about negotiations. I mean, I take Chris Wilkins' point that it was talks about talks, but of course it was a negotiation. We have been potentially negotiating. The UK has had the opportunity to influence, and we can call it talks or negotiations, but nevertheless, that it's not quite accurate, I think, to say that up until now there's been no negotiation. Where are we at the moment? Well, this week, the EU 27, some of you know this much better than me because you write in the newspapers, but the EU 27, the ministers have adopted new negotiating guidelines for the transition period. No surprises there, quite hardcore that the transition has to end in 2020 at the end of. No cherry picking. that the transition will look a lot like membership, so on and so forth. And I can come back to that if you like. So what is the current state? Well, it's moving into a new phase. I refer you to a very good book by an academic at Cambridge, Kenneth Armstrong, called Brexit Time. And I think that's a really nice sort of way of thinking about the state of the negotiations in time and so on. So we're currently moving towards potential transition. Number two, where are the negotiations going? Well, that, I think I've just covered that really. And
You've passed.
I've passed, yeah. What offer is on the table for the UK? Well, in a good academic fashion, I kind of contest the question, because the offer that's on the table for the UK, as we go along, that will be informed by what the UK says it wants and what it is successful or not in negotiating. But at the moment, it's true that what's on the table is a very clear idea of transition. There's also a willingness to talk about what comes beyond with real clarity, nevertheless, that post-transition the UK is a third country, and that there's no mincing of words. In some ways, the language is quite kind of it's quite unambiguous in EU terms. Is there something more bespoke that the EU can get? Well, that's the plan, isn't it? That we get something bespoke. I sort of refer back to the fact that negotiations are a two-way street, but there are challenges of ratification, there's challenges of unanimity and so on. So a bespoke deal is not looking terribly likely. But of course in the past, the EU does proceed by bespokeness in a way. Again, I was reading a very interesting article yesterday about Greenland and Algeria, which are sort of examples of countries or bits of countries that have actually taken themselves out of the EU at certain points in time.
Shall I break you just there?
No, because how sensitive...
More difficult than the daily politics. We're on then.
How sensitive are member states to the UK's problems? Well, it varies. And how concerned are they? Well, they're concerned, they're surprised. I don't think we should talk about Schadenfreude. That's not what I've picked up. And I think that there's a perception of a lot of self-inflicted harm on the part of the UK. And finally, can the UK exploit... Can the UK exploit divisions in member states? It's a bit unlikely, partly because of the political unity that we've talked about, partly because the UK as a negotiating partner is divided in itself, partly because it's one against 27 plus, partly because, thank you to my co-investigator Elena, what we've seen so far is really concession as strategy. So the UK's negotiating strategy has been concession. There's been very little, as you said, there's been very little attempt or success in adding value, in creating value of our own in the negotiations. So we're sort of very much in a take it or leave it position.
And obviously, I've been involved in this debate for far too long, I would say. But I remember publishing papers several years ago, and I know this is very boring to go back, but as I said to somebody before the event started, it feels a bit like a high school reunion, this, looking at some of the faces. So maybe it's good to go back in time a bit and remembering. And I remember publishing a paper on Brexit several years ago when we said a few things. We said Article 50 is going to be a problem because of its inherent time limitation and because once you trigger it, you're not in charge of the clock, so you give away leverage. And the odds are stacked against you. That's the definition of a leaving clause. No one would ever write the clause for exit to make it easy. So Article 50 is biased against you. Two, a Brexit vote will probably raise more questions than it answers because it's so incredibly difficult to find an alternative for Britain that would actually work. Because the off-the-peg models that we know that have been discussed to death clearly do not fully work for Britain. None of them do. Thirdly, the freedoms that will be created or that could be opened up as a result of the Brexit vote, for example, over-regulation, will be quite difficult to cash in on in practice because you always will come up against an inherent trade-off between regulatory freedom, for example, and market access. Fourth, once you vote to leave the EU, once the Brexit vote happens, that will simultaneously trigger a debate in the UK about, to some extent, the kind of country that Britain wants to be. And there will be an inherent tension between some of the policies that were advocated in the referendum or from the pro-Brexit camp and reality on the ground, particularly with respect to liberal free market policies and free trade. And finally, did I have a final point?
I don't know.
I did really well.
It's always
up until
that you
that
did.
point.
It's always the
I
problem with
also
people say, I've got
amazed
four
myself.
things to say.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the fourth one is. But maybe it'll
I cannot
come
read
back
my
to
final point. It was very good.
Why not? I'm going to throw it open to
But anyway, I was just going to say, I had
you
a
have got nothing to
conclusion.
say. Go on.
I
Sorry.
teed it up for a conclusion,
Sorry.
It's not like so I think that's pretty much where we're at, right? I think this is very much I was just only reminiscing here. I was actually making a valid one. I think that's pretty much where we're at, right? So these are the things that are playing out in front of us. So I think Article 50 was triggered before the government knew what it wanted, and some of that is quite natural because it's very difficult to know exactly what you wanted. But I think most of us will agree that it was probably triggered prematurely. The election then also meant that there were an additional few months that weren't spent on negotiating properly, which meant that everything was quite delayed on an already quite tight timetable. So I would make the argument, given all of that and given everything else I said about the assumptions we have about what Brexit would bring, getting to a point in December where we actually moved on to the next phase of negotiations was in some ways an extraordinary accomplishment. So I would very much say that this was very much a matter of negotiations in the first phase. Anyone who says differently hasn't been around the table in Europe, I would argue. I think so. So to find a way through there was quite extraordinary if we accept that we started from a very appalling base. So I actually think that from Christmas and onwards, things are looking a bit more hopeful. Final point for me then, to wrap it up, in terms of the next phase and the end destination. The UK, this is a clash of two fundamentally political red lines, right? I mean, that's what this is. On the UK side, it will remain, and we can argue about this, but I think it will remain for a very long time to be control over borders. The red line on the UK side is control over movement of people and control over borders. The red line on the EU side is, as we all know and as we hear all the time, is quite simply not to give Britain a better deal than what it has an EU member. And that will remain the case for a very long time to come for all the reasons that we're so familiar with. So these are the two red lines that constantly clash in all of these discussions. But between those two red lines, I would say, having said all the difficulties about Brexit and what I think we accurately predicted, I would say that at the end of the day, I think there is a way through to a bespoke deal for the UK that doesn't look half bad.
So you do believe there could be a bespoke deal on the table?
Yes.
You
No,
don't?
I want to say
might be.
it's not on the table necessarily, but when all is said and done, when the negotiation, everything has fleshed out, everything has materialized, I think there's a potential for a bespoke deal.